In this video, we're going to cover layers in Photoshop and just understanding the basics of how to use them in Photoshop as we work on projects. So we basically have two layers starting out in this file. This is going to be the file that we use for our retouching project. Obviously you have your own photograph that you can work with, but in this case we have two layers to start out with, and you'll notice by default most Photoshop documents will have a background layer, so we can basically unlock this. By default they are usually locked. If we double click that lock, it is going to basically rename the layer to layer 0 and then unlock it. So we can basically double click here and name it to something else. We'll just name it back to background. And then layer 1 here, we can basically rename this. This is our before photo, so we'll go ahead and name it before. It's good practice to keep that before photo on a layer. And we do have the ability right here to lock it, so we can click that lock so that we don't ever touch that layer until we want to when we unlock it. Okay, so we're going to go through and just cover a couple things about layers that are going to be really critical for you. One of those is the visibility of the layer, as well as understanding the order or the precedence of layers. So basically these eyeballs here in the layer panel will allow you to hide or show a layer so that it's either going to be visible or not visible. So as we go through, we also have the ability to reorder layers by just dragging them above or below. Okay, if you ever want to unlock, you should just be able to click that. I double clicked in that first example, but just clicking it once usually is enough. If you do want to rename, again, just don't forget double clicking on the name usually is the trick. If you double click on the layer, you may actually, and you'll see that's locked so we can't edit it, but if you double click when it's unlocked, it brings up layer styles, which we'll get into in another lesson. Just know that if that comes up, that means you're not double clicking on the name, so you do want to make sure you understand that difference. We do also have some options here down at the bottom. So for instance, you have this option, and let me unlock this so you can see. One of them is the trash can, so if you wanted to delete a layer, you would just literally either drag your layer to this trash can or click on this icon and it would delete whatever layer is selected. You also have create a new layer, so if I click on this right now, it's going to add a brand new layer. I'll Command Z so that we don't have too many layers going on that we don't need. And then we also have the ability to create a new group. So as we start to work on more complex projects, you may actually have a group that is for specific parts of your document. And literally to use these, we can put them inside of a folder or we can drag them out. Sometimes it's a little easier to drag above. And then basically it will either put it in or take the layer outside of it, depending on what you are preferring to do. Okay, so in this case I don't really need the group at this point, but it's good to know that they act a lot like layers, but it allows us to organize our files, and there's a lot of other things that will help us with groups later down the road so that we can keep things organized and be able to do more creative things with being able to organize our files. Okay, so going through, we also have options right here for things like opacity, and you will notice, and we're not really needing to do this for our photo, but it's good to know. So right here is the option to basically change the opacity, and it basically makes the photo somewhat transparent. So in this case, we do not necessarily want this for our photo, but in other creative projects we might want to be able to do that to a layer. Anytime you work in Photoshop, majority of the dialog boxes that have numbers here, we do have the ability to hover over, and you'll see the little arrows there. That allows you to scrub, so if we click and drag to the left, it lowers the opacity, and if we click and drag to the right, it increases the opacity. That works with fill as well, and we'll get into what fill is in another lesson. It is a nice feature to know about it, but it's not really necessary at this point. As we go through, we will start to learn more about masking as well, and this is going to be really useful. And then we also have options here for adjustment layers. This is one way that you could add them. I actually prefer to use the panel, which we'll get into in another layer demonstration for adjustment layers specifically. So with that said, we do have a couple more little things to show you with layers, just the basics of layers. This context menu up at the top right is going to give you a lot of features for layers, and we don't need to know all of them right now. But for instance, you do have options like merging layers, or you may need to flatten an image if you have a lot of layers and need to flatten it. That's very common before you print a file, but that does make sure your file is compressed so that it prints a little bit more easily. Just keep in mind that if you ever do flatten an image, that is getting rid of all your working files that disable your ability to edit the file. So you do want to keep that as a separate version if you ever save a flattened image. And then we also do have options here for a layer panel to look at some of these options, and we'll just open it up real quick. So by default, you can see the thumbnail is about this size. We can change the size if you want to be able to see it a little bit larger. You also have the ability to change the thumbnail contents. So by default, it's going to show you what's on the entire document, which I find useful. But in some cases, you may want to only see what's on the layer specifically. So those are options. And then we do have the option here for default masks on fill layers, expanding new effects, and then adding copy anytime you copy a layer. So for example, if I was to duplicate this now, I basically can either right click and do this or drag it down to the new layer icon, and it adds the word copy so that I know what the difference is between the two layers. You again could also rename this to retouch. So we do want to make sure that we know how to rename layers. As we work through this project, you will want the before layer locked. The retouch layer we're going to actually work on. And then this folder, for now, I'm going to delete it because I don't really need it. But as your layer becomes more complex, or your file does, we do have the ability to control those with groups so that we can come back in and organize our file. So just know it's quick to just add either a new layer or a new folder, and anytime you want to copy a layer, you can just drag it down to that new layer icon, or you can right click. So that's the basics of layers. We'll get into a lot more as we go. There are a lot of other things that we can do with layers, and we will talk a lot more about a lot of the other options that allow us to do more creative things with layers. So that is going to be really important for you guys to start to get the hang of, and hopefully this demonstration helps you understand just basics of using layers.